I've been a lawyer for nearly a decade, but this was a new one even for me. Faustus Manx had the unfortunate luck of having parents who were both literary majors, making his full name Faustus Dominus Manx, and having absolutely no interest in matters academic. He was a large man, covered in gang tattoos, with a disposition for theft that had started young. He was guilty of home invasion, breaking and entering, mugging, carjacking, and, finally, bank robbery. He had been given 25 years after a string of robberies with his little crew. The last time I had seen him, he had been led from the courthouse after I had talked the court out of a life sentence in prison. His parents' money had been well spent, I supposed. When he had called me out of the blue, after a year of no contact, I thought it must be a mistake. That was, until I agreed to see him and saw the state of him. I had seen him in the medical area, client-lawyer privilege getting me that far at least. He was cuffed to a table by the waist, since his current situation made it difficult to hook him at the wrists. He was a mess. He had lost 20 pounds. His face was gaunt. His beard was tangled and scratchy-looking. He had always been boyish and lean when I'd seen him in court, the picture of youth and vitality, but now he seemed to have aged 20 years. The last time I had seen him, he had also had both his hands. Faustus, you look like crap, if I'm being honest. He had sneered at that. I need your help, Prof. Someone hurt me bad. I need you to go get 'em. They can't do this to me. They can't do this to me and get away with it. He held up his stump as he yelled, and I saw the guards tensing. Shook my head at them. Calm down, Faustus. Tell me what's happened. I'll see if I can make a case. Calm down? Prof, a son of a bitch took my hand. He called me Prof because I had worked at the college with his parents as a law professor before going back to practice again. He had met me at a very young age, and I guess the name had stuck. I put a hand up to calm him, the guards getting antsy again. I wanted to hear about the removal of his hand, though. It was very draconian, after all, the removal of a thief's hand. I want to help, but I need to know what happened. Start from the beginning, and I'll tell you if there's a case to be had. Faustus sighed and began to speak. I'm a thief, you know. I can't say it's 'cause I needed money or anything. It's just 'cause I like to steal. I love taking things. It makes me feel powerful. It makes me feel in control. I ain't smart like you, like my parents. But when I'm stealing, man, I'm in control. No one can stop me. I was a great thief. It took one of my own guys snitching on me for them to catch me. At the end of it, I guess that's why I'm in this place, in this situation. I was convicted and sentenced to 25 years. I would have probably gotten life if it hadn't been for you, Prof. I was placed in close management dorm, a place that houses dangerous inmates like myself. It's not really so different from the rest of the prison. You go to the yard twice a week, you eat in the chow hall 3 times a day, you watch TV, you have inspection, and you sleep in your bunk every night. That was where I met Fox. That's what everyone called him, at least. And he was in there for life. We became friends on the first day. Fox approached me in the chow hall with a couple of his boys around him. Said he knew me. Said he'd been following my spree on the news. Said he would love to hear all about it. Well, I like to talk about myself. You know that. So I told him. We went to meals and evenings and walks around the track and discussing my crimes and my luck. I insisted that it was planning, but he insisted that it must have been luck that had carried me all this way. He said it so often that, hell, I even started to believe it. He brought me into his little gang, and there I lived very comfortably for a while. We talked a lot. He even pulled some strings and became my roommate, and we often sat up late, talking about the actions that had brought us here. I didn't know what exactly I was getting involved with, but I guess I learned. You see, Prof, while I was a thief, Fox, he was a monster. He had killed people, his old business partner's family to be exact. However, his one big regret seemed to be that he had never gotten his business partner too. He told me he was a former thief too, though his crimes were white collar. To hear him tell it, I was selling myself short. While I was robbing banks and making 5 or 6 G's, this guy was pulling down 500 or 600 G's a year. I was always very careful where I skimmed. 1,000 here, 5,000 there, and no one ever really suspected. The company I had founded made millions of dollars a quarter. They never missed what I took. Then, one day, my business partner called me up and told me to come to lunch. He took me to the most expensive restaurant in town, and after cocktails and steaks, he told me that he knew about the skimming and made an ultimatum. He would allow me to stay out of jail and even keep the money I had stolen. In exchange, he would be the sole owner of the company. In exchange for my shares, I could keep my freedom. What was I supposed to do exactly? He had asked me this while playing chess, a game he was amazing at, and I didn't know how to answer him. The answer, it seemed, was to burn his partner's house down. Not right away, of course. I was still afraid that he would rat me out, and I would be taken to prison. I stayed in the shadows, trying to make the money I had stolen last even, worrying that any day the police would come knocking. I had stolen hundreds of thousands, but I had chewed through a lot of it already. I'd bought expensive cars and treated people to lavish meals, and now I was regretting my decisions. I still had enough money to live for a while, not to my usual level of opulence, but well enough. That was until I saw that our company had sold. I was just watching TV one day, eating lunch, when I saw him mounting a podium to give a press conference. It was, with a heavy heart, he said, that he must announce his sale of our company. He was stepping down as CEO and would be leaving the company in the hands of the new owners. When they announced how much he had sold the company for, I felt the bowl slide out of my hand. He had cheated me. He had seen an opportunity and took everything from me. At that moment, nothing mattered. At that moment, I wanted revenge. And the rest was history. He had killed his ex-business partner's wife, son, and daughter in that fire, but had failed to kill the man he meant to kill. Then he tried to kill him again while he was in the courtroom, earning himself a life sentence. It appeared the only thing he had done right was to set up a fund to put money in his account while he was in here. Fox had cash, lots of cash, and he was pretty free with it. The fund he had set up was not technically connected to him, so the reparations could not be taken out of it to pay for his crimes as he rotted in prison, you see. It will buy me food and help insulate me from undesirables for the next 5 to 8 years, he had told me once. I asked him what he would do after that, and he just laughed. Very soon, I don't think I'll have this problem anymore. I asked him what he meant, but for a while, he wouldn't tell me. He just kept smirking at me, sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking. He was weird, Fox, and I was almost glued to his hip from day one. He and his boys didn't seem to want me to be far from him, and I was fine with that. I got protection, a share of his food stores, enjoyed the perks of knowing him. Guards treated him differently, murder or not, and he told me secretly that many of them were on his payroll. He had inmates in his employ, guards in his employ, and life was good under his wing. Then, one morning, he came to me and told me that tomorrow night was the night his plans would go down. I asked him what he meant, but he only winked and said he would call for me when the time was right. Then he disappeared near the start of the day, even before breakfast, and didn't come back for the rest of the night. I was getting worried. He'd never been gone this long. I lay down and I was beginning to think that maybe his plan had included getting out. I was kind of mad. I knew his bruisers were probably mad too. Why not let the rest of us in on the plan so we could leave after he got out? Surely he wasn't going through the woods. They said that place was haunted, and as I fell asleep, my dreams were plagued with images of my new friend running through the dark forest as he fled from ghosts or ghouls or something. Looking back, I can't believe I ever worried about that guy. I checked my watch and sighed as Faustus rambled on. Faustus, not that this isn't riveting, but is there a point? He looked affronted. Yeah, there is. Of course there is. If you'll shut the hell up and let me finish. You want to know how I lost my freaking hand, don't you? I waved for him to continue, and unfortunately he obliged. A guard came for me at 11 o'clock. He told me to get dressed and not ask a lot of questions. He cuffed me in the front, for appearances, he said, and led me from my cell across the yard. We went to the kitchens, somewhere I knew of but had never actually been to. He let me in, still in cuffs, and opened the door for me as the dark guts of the place stood open. I looked inside and wasn't real sure I wanted to go in there. Who's in there? I asked. You know who's in there. Get the hell in there before someone sees you, he growled. I took a step forward then, but turned to ask if he was going to take my cuffs off or what. When he pushed me in with his foot, I was so surprised that I fell face first into the kitchen. As the door was locked behind me, I turned my head, but he was already walking away as I started yelling. I wanted to know what the hell this was about. And when firm hands grabbed me into the arms and pulled me to my feet, I fought a little before I realized it was just the bruisers that Fox usually used. They got me back on my feet, and one of them told me to follow as they took me into the kitchen so I could see Fox. Fox was near the stoves, stirring a pot, and the contents were boiling hot. It looked like soup. It was bubbling kind of thick, and I made some joke about having a midnight snack. He looked at me, and he smiled with his mouth, but I was very aware that it never went to his eyes. His eyes were like ball bearings, steely and icy, and I wondered how often he had looked at me like that, and I just hadn't noticed. A snack? Oh no, Faust. This is tallow, candle wax. You wouldn't believe how hard it was to get this in here. I had to pay someone quite a lot of money for this. But it is the end of a long plan to escape. Tonight, I will walk from Stragview a free man, and it's all thanks to you and this pot of wax. I looked at him in surprise. Had he cracked? How was this pot of wax, and me, of course, gonna help him get out? I asked him if this was a joke or something, but I suddenly noticed that the two brutes had taken hold of my arms, and I started to understand the seriousness of this. Faust, have you ever heard of a hand of glory? I shook my head, but I was more interested in what I had suddenly noticed in his other hand. How had I missed that before? It had been hanging at his side, lost in the shadow of the dark kitchen as he stirred the pot. When he turned to look at me, though, I could see it glimmer in the slight light of the safety lights. All the tools were supposed to be locked in the tool cage. Everyone knew that. The knives were locked in a cage within a cage, just for extra safety. The butcher's knife he held was doubly impressive then, for that very reason. In the Middle Ages, he said, slapping the flat of the blade against his hand, people would take the hands of a dead thief and dip it in tallow and use it in their nefarious plans. The hand was supposed to have a multitude of powers, providing lights, making people invisible, unlocking doors, etc. I noticed, however, that it was always the hand of a dead thief. No one ever tried it with a living thief's hand, and I wonder if maybe that might make it even more powerful. Tonight, Faustus, I intend to find out. He checked the pot. Tallow's ready. It's just about midnight, too. Dip him, boys. I started struggling, his words finally sinking in. In this scenario, I was the thief, and he was going to take my hand. I struggled against the bruisers, but I might as well have been a toddler fighting against grown men. Fox took the pot off the stove, the knife laying on the lip now. The flames licked at the blade, getting it hot, red hot. That's when I realized it would be for what came next. They put me on my knees, looking down into that soupy mess as my hands were extended towards it. I held my arms against me defensively, yelling for help, screaming for anyone. Fox just went on smiling as he forced my arms out front. I resisted. Of course I did. But when he whispered in my ear, I felt some of my resistance melt away. I only need one hand, Faust. But if you keep fighting, I can just as easily make it two. Call me a coward, but the idea of living with no hands made me rethink my struggling. I immediately regretted it once my hands hit that wax. You see, he may have only needed one hand, but the way I was cuffed, both of them were going in the pot. The contents were boiling. The tallow was like liquid tar. I screamed and bucked as it hardened around them. They held my hands in that tallow for nearly 5 minutes, the skin scorching and searing as it was treated to a blazing bath. When they pulled them free, I was gasping and swearing, promising 1,000 terrible acts of revenge. As the wax hardened around my hands, I wanted to move them, to break the wax and ruin it, but I realized that they'd just dipped them again, and I tried to keep them still. It wasn't like I could have moved them anyway. My hands were burnt. The skin was blistered raw. I had lost feeling in them for the moment. Well, not all the feeling. I would learn that pretty quickly. They heaved me up, laying my arms across the butcher's table, as Fox spoke some words and readied his knife. He checked his watch, looked down at me one last time. His eyes were cruel, but he was smiling. His goal was in sight. I had seen this man look at people like that from time to time in the last few months. It was not a look I wanted aimed at me. It was the look that said he was about to take something from you, that you had something he wanted. It was a look a toddler gives another toddler before he snatches his toy and pushes him down. Stay absolutely still if you want to keep the other hand, Faust. My aim is good, but I can't be held responsible if you jerk at the last minute. And I take both. He held the knife up high, waiting, and as my watch chimed midnight, he brought it down. My left hand wasn't as dead as I thought it was. I screamed as it came off, the blade biting easily through the wrist. A gout of blood surged out, and the cuff slipped off as I writhed in pain. The hand sat dumbly on the table, no longer anything more than a totem for this crazy supplicant. But I fancied that I could feel it throbbing, longing to clench in pain. They dragged me over to the stove, and a new pain washed over me. They cauterized my wound with a stove burner, and then left me on the floor as Fox took my hand. Thank you, Faust. Thank you for your contribution to my revenge. I'll be sure to think about you while I'm choking the life out of that son of a bitch partner of mine. Then he and his flunkies just walked out of the kitchen, out of living memory, forever. I blinked at Faust. What do you mean, out of living memory? Surely they recaptured this man. He was walking around with a human hand, for God's sake. Faustus sat back, crossing his arms, and I could see that the burn scars on his other hand were severe. Nope. He and his flunkies disappeared into the night. They caught those two last week. They were robbing a gas station. Idiots. But Fox, he's still at large. I tried to make sense of this, but my attention was drawn back to Faustus as he leaned over the table and looked at me in his strange, too knowing way. What's more is that I remember the two bruisers, Horace and Avery, but Fox, what about him? You've been talking about him for the past hour." "That's just it, Prof. I've been telling you his name this whole time. But I'm betting you couldn't remember it, could you?" I shook my head, confused. "No, you just called him Fox the whole time." Faustus looked at me and grinned. "Nope, that's just what you've been hearing. That's what everybody hears. There is no inmate Fox, and the name I use cannot be heard, cannot be known." "Then how do you know it?" I asked, thinking I had stumped him. "Beats me. Probably 'cause he's using my hand or something. Whatever it is, I remember him, and no one else does." I scoffed loudly, frustrated, unsure what game he was playing. "Then why tell me at all?" Just because you can't find him doesn't mean you can't find his crimes. He's going to kill his business partner, the ex-owner of some big company. The company sold within the last 5 years and made a lot of money. The guy's family died 3 years ago in a fire that this guy started. If you can find him before Fox does, then maybe you can help him. I don't care about this guy. He's nothing to me. But I want someone to catch Fox. Motherfucker's got my hand. I want someone to take his life. That was hours ago. I'm now sitting in my study, sifting through hundreds of Google search results from the state of Georgia, looking for rich men who've lost their families to what is now probably a mysterious fire or have died recently from mysterious causes. If anyone can help me, I don't know if I'd tell you to look into it or not. Ever since I left the prison, I've been noticing a strange shape in the corner of my eye. It hides. It creeps. The idea of someone who can move without consequences is starting to seem much less far-fetched. If you find the man, warn him. If you don't, then forget you ever read this story, lest you find Fox's eyes on you as well. "Mr. Fuller." The tall man looked up through the curtain of greasy black bangs, and his face was equal parts good-natured annoyance and unshakable certainty. Detective Cutter liked the annoyance. Annoyed men could become angry, and angry men could make mistakes. But the certainty was going to make this exchange difficult. A man who was certain was a man who would play the game to win, and Detective Cutter was just as certain that this man was guilty. "Do you know why you're here?" Cutter asked, and he put the box down between them as he stood leaning over Fuller. He could not have done this if Fuller was standing. Of course, if Fuller had been any further into 6 feet, he would have been playing basketball somewhere instead of writing crime novels. Cutter was all of 5 feet, and only because his red Irish curls put him over the limit. He stood over Fuller now, though, not glowering, but not smiling, from a position of power that Fuller's certain and almost bright smile did not seem to understand. The game was over in the 9th inning, Holmes, and now it was all over but the crying. Fuller looked up at him like a professor looking at a bright pupil who's just broken the cardinal rule and asked a foolish question. "Don't you know?" he asked in a deep, cultured voice that made Cutter want to start slapping him. "I assumed that you must have after 2 officers came to my office to collect me." "Collect you?" Cutter snorted. "Mr. Fuller, you were arrested, Mirandized, and placed in an interrogation room. I'd say that's about as far from collected as it gets." "Come on, Officer Cutter. We both know that if you could charge me with anything, we wouldn't be here having this little chat right now." Cutter grabbed the chair next to him and spun it so he could lean against the back as he sat. It was a distinctly juvenile posture, but he accepted it as he settled in for the long match. He was tired, bone-weary from chasing this guy's shadow for the last 3 weeks, and he'd be damned if he'd let him slip away now. Marcus Fuller was going to answer for these murders if he had to sit here all week, and Cutter was settling in for the long run. "My captain likes you for this. Hell, I like you for this, and we have solid evidence that if you didn't pull the trigger yourself, then you know who did." Fuller just rolled his eyes. "And why would I want to commit murder? I'm a very successful writer, with 2 Sunday Times bestseller Noir awards. I live very comfortably, and I could easily retire from writing after my next book and maintain that comfort for the rest of my life. Why would I jeopardize that by killing prostitutes and thugs? Let's talk about that prostitute, shall we?" Cutter said as he reached into the box and took a thick manila envelope out. He flipped it open onto 2 pictures of a pretty brunette in her early 40s. The top photo showed her inviting guests into a newly opened Royal Casino, while the bottom was her being booked a few years before for solicitation. Her expression was the same in both photos, devil-may-care attitude with a side order of iron poise. Marjorie Dyer, the proprietor of Dire Needs, was found murdered in her suite at the Seawind Resort. He flipped the page, and behind it were several shots of a glassy-eyed Marjorie, who was no longer poised or so devil-may-care. She lay naked across a hotel bed, with a long, angry cut from one ear to the other, and a thick collar of blood clotting around the wound, making it hard to see. Hotel staff received a noise complaint about 11, and hotel security found her that way at 11:30. He had hoped the grisly scene would shock Fuller. He had hoped for revulsion, hoped Fuller would turn green or be sick in the wastebasket, or even that he would appear excited by the photos and tip his hand in front of the detective. Instead, he studied them for a moment and then looked back at Cutter expectantly. "Very graphic, Officer Cutter. What does this have to do with me?" Detective Cutter reached into the box as he spoke. "The murder scene of Marjorie Dyer is nearly the same as the killing of Catherine Hoff in your book Hunter City." He removed a dog-eared paperback from the box, and Fuller didn't seem at all surprised to see it. "If you'll indulge me, Mr. Fuller," and before Fuller could protest, Cutter had opened the book to the paragraph in question. "Hold her, Jack. I'm about to send Regis a message." As the switchblade came to life, Kat began to struggle between Jack and Anthony. Her tears made black pools of her mascara, and when Hunter lifted her chin to look her in the eye, she had long tracks down either side of her face. He waggled the blade in front of her, and she cringed away as the steel glinted in her eyes. "Please, Glenn, please don't do this. We can make a deal. I'll work for you instead of Regis, but please don't hurt me." And she dissolved into shuddering sobs again. She stopped when Hunter pressed the edge against her throat. "It's nothing personal, Kat. It's just business." She sighed like a split seam as the knife parted her flesh and her blood poured across the swell of her modest breasts. When Hunter's gentleman released her, she fell back onto the bed with a kind of boneless grace. Hunter only spared her a final glance before he strode into the hall and left her alone in his makeshift abattoir. Fuller indulged him as he read, and when Cutter finished, he only sat expectantly. "What do you make of that, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter asked, when it seemed Fuller would not break the silence. "Seems like a fan of my work decided to reenact some of his favorite scenes. As I told you the first time you came snooping around my office, I was at a charity event that night. A dozen people will corroborate that I was present until well past midnight. So unless I'm under arrest for writing a compelling crime drama, are you familiar with the murder of Gerald and Jamal Smith, Mr. Fuller?" Cutter cut him off mid-sentence. Men like Fuller hated to be cut off, and he felt confident that the act would unnerve him. It didn't. "I'm afraid I'm not," Fuller said, crossing his arms and appraising Detective Cutter with light disapproval. They were hired muscle for Selectman Kane, a local crime boss in the area, all three of whom also bear a striking resemblance to Boyle, Barker, and Regis Angel from Hunter Street. Fuller rolled his eyes and sighed deeply in his throat. "Do tell." Both Gerald and Jamal were visiting a tavern below Kane's office when their drinks were spiked with rohypnol. Both were large men, Mr. Fuller, and both had a lot of experience with guns, as did Boyle and Barker. Boyle and Barker, as you recall, were drugged by Glenn Hunter before he assailed the home of Regis Angel. Both sets were shot on the stairs as they tried to return to their boss. Their nerves dulled, they were easy prey for both Glenn Hunter and our current mystery killer. Then, of course, there's the nature of Selectman Kane's death. "Let me guess," said Fuller. "Drowned in the bath?" Cutter flipped through the file and settled it back on the table. "Close. Drowned in the sink." The photos were of a man in his late 50s, lying face up in a utility sink. His shoulders had been forced down into the wide basin, and his face was a spiderweb of cuts and scratches where the faucet had battered him. One of his eyes bulged grotesquely, as the other stared glassily at the photographer. Fuller looked at this with no more interest than he had the others, and when he looked up, his eyes questioned Cutter on what he hoped to accomplish. He didn't catch Selectman Kane in the bath. He was forced to improvise by drowning him in a utility sink. Kane fought, but forensics says his attacker finally broke his back and forced him down into the utility sink to properly drown him. That's not from one of my books, Officer Cutter, as well you know. No, but Hunter did drown Regis in a bathtub after killing his bodyguards in a stairwell. I got the passage somewhere here. He removed his copy of Hunter Street from the box as well. He turned to the back and saw Fuller wince as he bent the pages back to read the highlighted paragraph. That's more of a reaction than he had given to the entire photo album, Cutter thought, as his eyes found the spot. Hunter watched as Wagner's eyes went wide as he pushed through the bathroom door. Wagner reached for the gun in his jacket, but the little silenced pistol in Hunter's hand woofed softly. He felt the angry burn as the acoustics of the bathroom turned the Rise of the Valkyries into a cover for the loud, wet slap of the body as it hit the floor. Hunter entered the small door between the bathroom and the washroom unnoticed. As he pushed the large form of Regis Angel under the water, he was rewarded with total surprise. The old man was still quite strong, and had it not been for the surprise of the attack and the slippery bathtub in which he was lounging, Hunter thought that he would have been in for a real fight. As he drowned him, he bent over him so he could watch the life leave his eyes. If you watch a powerful man draw his last breath, some of his spirit will be transferred to you, boy. His grandfather had told him this 1,000 times if he'd told him once. As the struggling stopped and the great shadow of Regis Angel left the world, however, Hunter felt little save the deep sense of satisfaction and a staggering sense of loss. "You're reaching, Detective," Fuller scoffed, but Cutter noticed the change in title, and it seemed a victory, if a small one. "He was drowned on his back, Mr. Fuller, which leads us to believe his attacker wanted to watch him die." "Which supports the theory of a copycat," Fuller barked, pushing up from his seat to glower at Cutter. "Just because you beat this dead horse over and over again, Detective, does not mean it's going to give you anything but... Your third book was a bit of a disappointment, wouldn't you say, Mr. Fuller?" That shut him right up. He stopped mid-sentence and goggled at Cutter, as if he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. If Fuller wanted to play the copycat game, Cutter was ready to drop his final bit of damning evidence. He was more than happy to let Fuller back himself into the corner first, though. Fuller blew out a long breath. "I don't see how that's relevant at all to your case." "A dozen rewrites, not well received by the fans, and the reception at the ending was bad enough that you had to write a fourth book and turn the Hunter trilogy into a Hunter quartet. That had to sting a little, wouldn't you say?" That was a decision I made on my own," he snapped, but Cutter didn't care. He had this guy, and he knew it. The first two pieces were only appetizers, and after he served up the main course, he'd be more than happy to give this guy his just desserts. "Well, the most recent murder was very reminiscent of another scene from your book." "Oh, please do tell. Someone kill a big stupid brute on the street with a machine gun? Poison a congressman? Maybe slit a whore up the..." Cutter threw down an open folder and watched the pompous prick deflate like an old balloon. "We had to request the manuscript from his secretary when we found out you had written a fourth novel. She was so distraught that she sent it over immediately. This, Mr. Fuller, is the reason you're here." Fuller looked far more unsettled by these photos than anything else that day. This can't be. I just talked to Dan last week. Danforth Wilde was murdered in his apartment last week, 3 days after you threatened him over social media for stealing the premise of Hunter State for his noir series. You said you would make him regret every word he published, didn't you? I guess maybe he regrets it now, doesn't he?" Fuller sat, looking at the pages for several seconds, before closing his eyes and sighing. He was eviscerated, just like the congressman in Hunter's Stand. "My agent was the only one who had a copy of the manuscript, so of course, you think..." He closed the folder and glared at Cutter. "Hook me to a lie detector, Detective. Call my assistant and ask her where I was when Dan was killed. I have no receipts for travel, I have taken no leave from work, and you will find no way I could have done these things. Now, unless you're prepared to hold me under suspicion, I demand that you release me." Cutter stared at him for nearly a minute before shaking his head with a deep sigh. He had hoped he could grill the answers out of Fuller, but the guy was too slick for that. His captain was going to rake him over the coals for this one, and Cutter could already hear the sounds of pens signing his leave of absence. "Go, then," he said, waving his hand at the door, and Fuller left with a little slam as the door shut behind him. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of suspension from duty. Cutter drained the whiskey from his glass and slid it back towards Mike. He had had his first drink right here at the Fighting Cock, and he suspected it would be where he took his last. You shake enough trees like he had, and you were bound to have something fall on you eventually. Guys like Fuller, though, they made him ache for a drink. The door jingled, and Cutter didn't even look up as someone plopped down next to him. They thought I might find you here," said a familiar, cultured voice. "I need your help." Cutter blew a chuckle into his shot as he knocked it back. "You dance around justice, get me suspended for 3 weeks, and expect me to—" He flinched a little when he looked at him. Fuller had a long, jagged cut across his face, and his left eye looked like a few more punches would have broken the socket. He caught Mike's eye, and the barman seemed to be trying to decide whether to call the police or let Cutter handle this. In the end, he offered him a rag from behind the bar and slouched off out of earshot. Fuller sat down next to him, and his eyes darted towards the door like a trapped animal. "I need you to protect me. The man who's been murdering these people has been staying with me for several months now. He's also responsible for the 4th Hunter book, and until tonight, I thought his killings were something benign, a way to clean up the streets, if you will. When I confronted him about Dan, though, he just went crazy and tried to kill me in my apartment." "Slow down," said Cutter, as he took a pad from his pocket. "Let me get some information first." He wobbled a little on his stool as the alcohol settled over him like a cloud. The shots were beginning to catch up with him, but he wanted to be sure he got everything verbatim. If he could bring this information to his captain, then maybe they'd rescind his suspension. "Let's start with a name. Who tried to kill you?" Fuller took a deep breath before saying the last name Cutter would have ever expected. "Glenn Hunter." Everything changed the day that Jarrett Ray killed himself. He had been a YouTube star, an internet darling, and his life had been a TV show since he picked up a guitar. The video of an 8-year-old Jarrett Ray learning his chords is still on his memorial channel. The sight of him playing beside his granddad, the old man smiling and cackling as the young boy devoured his lessons, is tear-jerking. People talk about how you could just tell so-and-so was happy because it was written all over their face. Well, it was true in this case. Bobby Ray, Jarrett's granddad, was truly happy when he watched his grandson play those first halting chords from the chair beside him. He'd tell Jarrett 10 years later, his hands and muscles withered from cancer, that teaching him to play had been the proudest moment of his life. Police have found another apparent suicide in Little Brine today. This brings the death toll into the thousands, with the numbers in the millions expected by the end of the day. I looked up from the tea I'd been making and sighed. All this because of some stupid tart who couldn't tell when she was supposed to be ashamed. I'd been watching the reports come in all day. After the video had gone viral, it was all anyone could do to keep up with the death toll. All this over a song. All this because someone wrote a song. But it was more than a song, wasn't it? He'd won his 5th grade talent show, his 6th grade, and 7th grade as well. By the time he was in 8th grade, the administration had simply let him close the show. Every year he wrote a new song, just for the occasion, and many of them made their way onto his albums after he'd been discovered. During the interview they did for the documentary, his classmates spoke about how he had left them in tears. They said there would never be anyone like Jarrett, and when Jarrett sang, it was like he was singing just for you, like he was the only other person on earth. The numbers are only just starting now to solidify. 750,000 deaths worldwide, with another 5 million expected by the end of the day. This is a global crisis, and the numbers are just beginning to come together. Of the nearly 7.5 million people worldwide who watched the video, only those reported have been discovered dead, which begs the question, when will the others surface? I had to watch the news on my old TV set. I had turned off the router and the modem hours ago. I couldn't risk Sophia. I put the thought out of my head immediately. If she couldn't get on her tablet, she'd come out here. There would be no reason for her not to. She'd been home with a fever today, so she'd slept through most of the news reports. Some small part of me was glad I had managed to cloister her. If she had been at school when the video had went live, who knows? Jarrett had started his rise to fame as many did at the time. He recorded himself singing, playing the guitar, and posted it on YouTube. He was a moderate success, the people from his hometown pushing his numbers a little, but he never rose above a few thousand views. When they announced YouTube Talent, an invitation for YouTubers to send in their best and try to get discovered, he submitted his video and found the audience he'd been seeking. The adoration he'd found for his music at school was multiplied by 1 billion, and from there, the sky had been the limit for Jarrett. His music touched people, made them discover things they never knew they'd lost. I can remember fondly when one of his songs had come on the radio at work. For those 2 or 3 minutes as he sang, it was as if no one could have a bad day. No one could be anything less than fantastic and in a wonderful mood, and the world was just a little brighter while he was in it. He was our songbird, but we ultimately took him for granted. Deaths have reached a catastrophic level. 3 million people dead, and somehow the views just keep rising. The death toll is now expected to be somewhere around 250 million before the end, as people go to see what all the fuss is about. News outlets are begging viewers not to indulge their curiosity, as the video has been confirmed to have a nearly 100% death rate thus far. He had met Crystal while guest hosting Saturday Night Live. She had a track record for loving and leaving influencers, breaking their hearts and taking their money if they were dumb enough to marry her. She seemed to have her eyes set on Jarrett. Their love affair was one for the tabloids, a string of fights and makeups, and public declarations of love or anger. She wanted to be a musician, it seemed, and even her middling talent couldn't pull down his star. She appeared with him on several albums, came on stage with him at concerts, but at the end of the day, it was Jarrett they came to see, and she knew it, hated it. She was a 24-year-old time bomb who was about to destroy the world with her need for attention. When she left him after 5 years together, the world sighed with relief. They gasped, however, when she accused him of abuse. She had bruises, a very convincing black eye, and the ear of a tabloid writer who told her whole story in glaring prose and glossy pictures. She made the talk show circuit, telling about her harrowing experience and their toxic relationship. Eventually, Jarrett was called upon to defend himself in the court of public opinion. It was crap. He claimed she had left because she had ultimately gotten everything out of their relationship that she could, other than his name. He was tired of putting up with her tantrums and her public spectacles and was ready to move on with his life. Their relationship was not a sustainable one, and he was looking for more than someone to make bad press with. They had drifted apart, and it was time for them to move on to better things. He was reasonable and adult about the whole matter, but people didn't want reasonable, even with a media darling like Jarrett. She cried and pouted while he sat and reasonably explained, and the audience ate their daily dose of drama. We have reports of a group of students on the roof of a high school in Des Moines. Unresponsive to verbal commands, they are ignoring police as they... Oh God, they've jumped! As emergency services try to save who they can, we can see more students coming out of the emergency hatch and preparing to join their fellow students. His reputation was ruined. There was never any proof that he had or hadn't hurt Crystal, but she fashioned her story into a lucrative book deal and a successful music career. Jarrett, on the other hand, was damaged goods. He was unbookable. His sales plummeted, and his songs slowly stopped playing on the radio. It seemed that no one wanted to be seen supporting a suspected abuser, and his star had now begun to fall. The next 3 years would see him in and out of rehab, falling hard into drug use and depression, and when he came out, he went back to YouTube with something very different. Reports are coming in about a group of men who have set themselves on fire in Kaito. Their dying is quiet, dignified, and they burn without so much as a whimper, Kaito authorities say. When he returned, his music wasn't the same. The upbeat, happy songs full of hope were replaced with melancholy ballads full of despair and hopelessness. Someone sent me one of his songs in a YouTube link once, and I swear you could feel it sucking the air out of the room. He conveyed every ounce of his suffering in his song, and though his views were just as high as they had always been, no one talked about his music now. His music was a monster that was best left under the bed. No one wanted to listen, but their curiosity wouldn't let them look away. We have cell phone footage of 3 men jumping into a cave mouth in Arizona National Park. The cave, usually requiring climbers to rappel to reach the floor, is nearly a mile deep. Emergency services are still attempting to get the bodies, and 2 members of the EMS are said to have joined the jumpers upon their arrival. 2 days ago, Jarrett made his last YouTube video. He finished something haunting, halting, tears streaming down his cheeks as he poured his soul into every note. He played acoustically, and his guitar was not tuned. The jangling melody of his untuned strings were ethereal, almost industrial. As he played, it was like watching some dying animal limp through the forest towards the spot where it will drop. As he came to a close, his voice trailing off painfully, he turned to the camera and thanked the audience. He thanked them for their loyalty, for their time, for their support, and for everything they had shown him during these trying times. He informed his audience that this was the last time he'd be on YouTube, and wished them all a very happy life. Then he turned his camera off and walked away from life as anyone knew it. He killed himself in the bathtub that night. His mother found him with both wrists slit. Though she was horrified, she told someone that he died with the most serene look stretched across his face. Whatever he had been thinking about as he ended it all had given him such joy as he slipped off with it still in his mind. And so, Jarrett played his final song that night and passed into the annals of history. Well, that's not all he did, I suppose. The death toll swells to 3.5 million as medical services scramble to handle the influx of bodies. His death went mostly unremarked. A small service was held for him, and his body was interred in his hometown. A short squib about him went out on social media and on the news circuits. Outside of a handful of fans, though, everyone seemed to be comfortable just to forget about him. His death was sad, of course. The loss of someone so young and so talented is always sad. But people seem ready to move on and put all this behind them. And they would have if it hadn't been for Crystal and a voicemail that should have been private. She appeared on Snapchat one night, raccoon eyes and everything, to tell her fans about a voicemail she had received from Jarrett the night he had killed himself. I was at a charity event when he called, and I completely forgot about it until I saw it tonight in my missed calls. His voicemail lives on as his last words. He wanted me to give a gift, his last gift, and I think it's only right that I share his last moments with all of you. She held the phone up to the microphone, and from it spilled a monotone that no one had ever heard from Jarrett before. "Hello, Chris. I guess you're too busy to talk to me, so just listen. I've written you a song. Remember when I used to do that? It's just for you, so make sure you don't share it with anyone else. Something you can remember me by after I'm gone." She looked at the camera and sniffed a little as she smudged her raccoon eyes for effect. "I'll be playing that song live tomorrow night on Facebook. I haven't even heard it yet, but I just know that all of you will want to hear Jarrett's last song live at 8 p.m. on Facebook." True to her word, the very next night she played the song for everyone to hear. Police are again advising people to stay indoors. Close your windows. Do not open the doors unless emergency personnel call for you to do so. There is a fear that others might be weaponizing this phenomenon. The song was nothing like anything we had ever heard before. He had left her 2 messages, it would seem, and the second was a dirge sung a cappella. It was deep and halting, his voice spilling all the angst and pain he'd been keeping inside for 3 years. He bled his words for her, and the nearly 20,000 people who watched, and in the end, he simply hung up and was ended forever. Crystal cried, of course, and talked about how important he was to her, despite how things had ended. She wished that Their relationship could have gone on indefinitely, wished they could have spent their lives together, and thanked her fans for experiencing this moment with her. 2 days later, she was dead. Someone has thrown a Molotov cocktail through the doors of the YouTube corporate office. The platform claims to be blameless in all this, but its failure to act in regards to the video's takedown leads others to question its negligence. The next 2 days were awash with odd Facebook posts and strange Snapchat stories from Crystal. She claimed there were people in her house. She did a walking tour of her house in which she shouted at things only she could hear and brandished a knife. She told her fans that she thought Jarrett's ghost was haunting her, trying to get her to kill herself. She had a 2-hour video of nothing but her crying on the floor of her closet as she sobbed that people were outside the door, saying she should drown herself in her swimming pool. It all came to a head on the second day when she posted her final video. At 11:30 p.m., a staggering and slurring Crystal posted one last video to Snapchat. I found these pills in my medicine cabinet. They helped a little, but I can still hear his voice. He's telling me how this is my punishment, how I deserve to die. And you know what? He's right. I ruined Jarrett's career. He never hurt me. I just couldn't stand the idea that he could keep living and loving and being loved by people after I left. I'm a heartless bitch, and I deserve this. They found her in her pool the next day. She was the first casualty, but not the last. Mass panic in Singapore. People take to the streets, looking for their loved ones as the death toll. I heard the door to the back room open as Sophia wandered into the living room. She looked very childlike for a girl of 14, and I was glad for her. Let her be innocent a while longer. She would have to grow up soon enough. She lay her head on my lap, watching the TV with a sense of dread as she took in what was going on. She didn't ask me about her phone. I had slipped in and taken both her phone and her tablet while she was asleep. She only laid her head against my lap and watched the news talk about the deaths in China and the deaths in Russia and the deaths right here in our own hometown. As we watched, I continued to listen as a story that only I could hear played over and over again in my head. He had learned to play the guitar at 8 years old. His grandfather had died of cancer. He was a local celebrity by the time he was 12. Crystal had ruined his life. It was an endless on and on and on. I'd been trying to block it out for the better part of 6 hours, but it just kept going no matter what I did. Someone had posted the video of Crystal's live stream to YouTube shortly before her death. As of this very second, 600 million people had heard what the media was calling Jarrets Dirge, and I was one of those people. Even as the first reports were coming out, I listened to the song via a Facebook link from my sister Pam. Pam had sent me a text an hour ago saying her farewells and wishing me luck. The voices had been rising in frequency, increasing in volume with every repetition. As I stroked my daughter's hair, I began to wonder how long I would last. "He learned to play at 8, you know," she said, and the words sent a chill up my spine. "What?" I asked, looking down at Sophia as she lay watching the steadily increasing death toll. "His grandfather taught him to play the guitar at 8 years old. He told him on his deathbed that it was the proudest moment of his life." "Mom, I'm scared. How long is this going to last?" My stroking hands felt clammy as they slid over her straight hair, and as she waited, I realized that I had no answer for her. We were two amongst millions, and we would see how long it took before the dirge had us as well. I was not at fault here. I don't understand why the universe has decided that I should suffer. As I lay here and listen to his throaty, phlegm-filled breathing, I consider again the idea that ending it might be best. It wasn't my fault. I didn't cause what happened to him. He should have just left me alone. Now I'm the one who must suffer his company, maybe for the rest of my life. The day had started with a hard slap of rocks against my window, and I loosed a loud sigh as I thrust the covers away from me. Every morning. Every goddamn morning. I hadn't had to buy an alarm clock since I moved in, so I suppose that was something. As another handful of stones cascaded against the window, I swung angrily out of bed and shifted the curtains open. I did not open the window right away. You only made that mistake once. The pudgy man-child on the sidewalk had just reared back to throw another handful when he saw the window open and smiled happily. That smile showed me every inch of his yellow teeth, his spotted gums, and the spit that covered his half-rotten teeth in a sheen of translucence. He was dressed in his usual attire, and I imagined I could smell him from 2 floors up. He wore ratty Chuck Taylor sneakers, cargo shorts in February that likely hadn't been washed since his mother had bought them from JCPenney, a ratty black trench coat that covered his grease-stained t-shirt depicting a busty anime girl who seemed overjoyed to be stretched across his voluptuous C-cup breasts, and a wispy beard that made his face look dirtier somehow, and the battered black fedora that capped it all off. This is what he had worn, or some iteration of it, every day since we had first met 2 years ago, and I shook my head as he waved a pudgy hand at me. "Good morning, m'lady." He knew my name. I'd told it to him 1,000 times, but he always insisted on calling me m'lady.
"Kenneth, what the hell do you want?"
I was grumpy about being woken up, and sour about Kenneth being the first person I saw 9 mornings out of 10. "Well, I just thought that since we work today, I'd offer to walk you. We're on the same shift again, so just seems like you might appreciate the company." I sighed. I would have appreciated the company. Any company but Kenneth's.
"I'm gonna be a minute, Kenneth. A long minute, so feel free to just go on without me."
I can wait for you. I'll be right here when you get done. When you're ready. Unless you'd rather I wait inside." He snorted through a partially clogged nose. I saw the gleam that came into his piggy eyes and shuddered.
"I'd rather you went on without me, Kenneth, but since there's nothing I can do to stop you from waiting, I suppose you can just wait on the front porch."
I closed the window then, blocking him out and pulling the curtains closed, as I went to get ready for work. Every day. Every goddamn day. I've been living in this townhouse for the last 2 years, and I should have known that the rent was too good to be true. The lady who showed me the house was very complimentary about the neighborhood. She talked about the convenient garbage pickup, the cost-effective water measures she had installed, the proximity to restaurants in downtown, and all at a cost that was nearly half of the other rentals in the area. I had been attending college at the time, the college being about 3 blocks from my apartment, and it had sounded like a real sweetheart deal. I was moving my stuff the first time I met Kenneth. I say met, but I smelled him before I saw him. Have you ever been next to someone on the subway who maybe doesn't shower regularly? The kind of person who covers it up with body sprays instead of just washing their clothes and wearing deodorant. The kind of person you don't really want to stand too close to because their clothes look like they might get grease on yours if they brush up against you. That was what I was assaulted by as this mountain of a man came wandering over to introduce himself. He was dressed in cargo shorts and a t-shirt that day, the July heat too much for even his trench coat to handle, with a pair of sandals that put his yellow toenails on display. I was carrying a box of books inside when I heard him greet me by name. That should have been my first indication that something was afoot. "Hey, welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Kenneth. My mom said I had a new tenant, but she failed to mention how beautiful she was. Would you like some help?" I had thanked him, but Kenneth's idea of helping seemed to entail watching me move boxes while he talked my ear off about video games, anime, and fantasy roleplay. He was aghast that a girl as worldly as me, whatever that was supposed to mean, had never seen an anime. I admitted that I had watched some Sailor Moon when I was in elementary school, mostly because it was on when I got home. He scoffed at that, though, and waved a pudgy hand at the mention of what he called girly anime. The fact that I didn't play D&D or video games was also a subject he wished to remedy. Thankfully, I had moved all my stuff in by the time he started talking about the 3rd or 4th game franchise, of which he was a super fan, and I thanked him for his help.
"I'm going inside to unpack now, so I'll see you."
"Ooh, I can help you unpack if you like." I'd been standing in the doorway when he said it, the front door the only thing that lay between him and I. The look that crossed his face when he offered to help me unpack was akin to a cat left to guard a mouse. I could just picture his grubby man-child fingers pawing through my clothes, finding some reason to stumble across my underwear, pressing my shirts to his pug nose, and had to stifle a full-body shudder.
On second thought, I'm pretty tired, Kenneth. I think I'm going to rest and unpack tomorrow. Have a good night.
He started to protest, but I closed the door on him and locked the deadbolt. The door had 3 locks: a twist lock, the deadbolt, and the top chain. I engaged all of them before turning around to make something to eat. I had already decided that I would unpack before going to bed today, leaving Kenneth with no excuse to go upstairs and touch any of my things. His annoyance had become creepy pretty quick, and I did not want him hanging around any more than I could help. I had just gotten to the entryway to the small kitchen when I heard an unsettling noise from the front door. I turned and found the doorknob twisting a little, as whoever was on the other side tried to quietly open my door. I thought about seeing who it was, but my fear had a firm grip on me. Home is where you're supposed to feel safest, and that turning knob negated any safeness I might have felt. I couldn't prove it was Kenneth, but I couldn't prove it wasn't. The turning stopped after a few seconds, and I made a mental note to get a chain for the back door, too. The first 6 months were probably the least eventful. I enjoyed my newfound freedom of having my own space, but I definitely noticed some of the strangeness in the house. I would come home to find things moved or find things missing, and I suspected that Kenneth had been in while I was gone. More than once I would catch a whiff of Axe body spray upstairs, a smudge on something that looked like a fingerprint, or just something moved that shouldn't have been. Kenneth came over to hang out a lot, and I quickly got tired of having him around. He was always overly friendly, almost fawningly so, and I began to suspect that he had a crush on me. He brought over anime or his Xbox, and I have spent many evenings reading subtitles or watching him finish some level on a game. He was annoying, but I felt that he was ultimately pretty harmless, and the movies he brought over were sometimes pretty cool. He seemed harmless, if not a little clingy. Anytime I would start to feel the least bit comfortable around him, though, I remembered that look on the doorstep and began to rethink. I gave his mother a key the first time I changed the locks, telling her I suspected an old tenant was using the key to come and go as they pleased. After I found the chain off the back door, something I was zealous about keeping chained at all times, I didn't bother giving her a key. After that, the intrusions stopped. Then, COVID had happened. The city did the lockdown thing, and suddenly all the classes were online, all the functions were canceled, and I was spending more time than usual inside my apartment. During this time, unfortunately, my grades began to suffer. Some people can absolutely take classes online and do fine, but I'm not one of those people. I was one of those popular girls in high school who liked to bask in a place's environment and social structure. Suddenly, having professors that I couldn't talk to face-to-face was hurting my grades. Suddenly, not having peers to talk to review notes with, and to bounce ideas off of was hurting me, and as my grades suffered, the school threatened to take away my grant. The grant was how I paid for housing, so I doubled down and tried to bring them up again. I studied long hours, watched tutorials on YouTube, and read anything that I could find on the subject matter, but nothing seemed to help. Kenneth also did not help with this particular problem. Despite the order to wear masks and social distance, Kenneth was always trying to come over and hang out like he used to. He wasn't in school, all his friends were already online, and neither he or his mother thought this was more than the flu. I don't know how many times I would look through the peephole and find him maskless on my front porch with an anime box set of something or his Xbox waiting for me to hang out. I tried to be nice to him, but as my grades suffered, so did my mental health, and I started ignoring him after a while. Then, after a horrible semester, my grant was cut, and I was left waiting to re-up next year. That's how we'd come to our current predicament, me working and Kenneth being paid to hang out with me. I came out the front door 45 minutes later to find him sitting on my porch swing, his phone in his hand, and his rocking making the chains grind together annoyingly.
Is that really what you're wearing to work?
It's not like they care. It's Walmart. As long as you show up, they don't care what you have on. He had a point, but I still tried to tune him out as we walked to work together. I had started working at Walmart after my savings started to dwindle. My landlord, Kenneth's mother, cut my rent a little. Because of all this pandemic nonsense, she said, with a little scoff. However, it still only floated me another month or so before I needed to get a job. Walmart was hiring, and they needed warm bodies. Kenneth didn't work there right away, but after hearing that I had started working there, he was soon applying for a job as well. Charles, one of my assistant managers, was a gaming buddy of his, and I assumed the source of my constant stock shifts with Kenneth. It was a real toss-up, which one of them I hated more these days. Kenneth was unnaturally quiet on the way to work today. His face had that look that let me know he was thinking about something very hard, and I feared that he would ask me out again. He had asked me out about once a month since I moved in, and I had just started ignoring him, despite his mother's pressure. I got the feeling that she was getting worried about him not leaving the nest, and she hoped that a nice girlfriend would be enough of a mother stand-in to help him get out of her basement and into mine. Sorry, Mama Kenneth, but that dog wasn't hunting in these woods. She could find some other girl to pawn her precious angel off onto. So, m'lady, he said, finally finding his courage, you may have noticed that, Valentine's Day is tomorrow. I rolled my eyes at him theatrically.
It had somehow escaped me after unloading a metric ton of Valentine's Day candy and toys over the past month, Kenneth. But thanks for bringing it to my attention.
Well, I was just wondering if you'd like to be my Valentine this year and go on a date with me tomorrow. I sighed. Every year with this guy.
No, Kenneth. For the 1000th time, no.
Kenneth's face got that look about it that small children get when you tell them no. But why? Don't tell me you already have a date.
Nope, sure don't. I intend to stay in on Valentine's Day since I have the night off.
Well, that's fine. We don't have to go out or anything. We can stay in and rent a movie and maybe cuddle on the couch. And I rounded on him then, my frustration and lack of patience getting the better of me, as I erupted liquid hate all over this yipping puppy of a man.
No, Kenneth, I have told you no 1,000 times, and the answer will always be no. I don't want to date you. I hardly want to be your friend most days. And the thought of you sitting next to me on the couch gives me hives. Move on!
Kenneth just stood there, his face transitioning between barely contained tears and barely contained rage. His mouth seemed like it wanted to say something, but his brain seemed to be holding it at bay. He looked like he was trying to chew himself from the inside out, and the tears seemed to win out in the end. His eyes began to flood with impotent water, the flood falling to his t-shirt as he turned and ran back towards home. He looked like one of those anime characters he loved so much as he fled from his spurning, and I guessed later that might have been his intention. I let him go, making sure he rounded the corner before turning to head to work. Some of us still had bills to pay. I thought that maybe Kenneth would have learned a little something after my outburst, but he clearly hadn't. I got home very late that night to find him sitting on my porch with a heart-shaped box of chocolates. "M'lady," he wheezed, rising ponderously from the seat, "you've returned to home at long last." The look on my face should have told him everything he needed to know about how glad I was to see him. I brushed snow off the shoulder of my jacket and wondered how long he'd been sitting there waiting for me. It had been chilly when I'd gotten to work, but not really uncomfortably so. That had changed quickly over the last 8 hours, and all anyone at work could talk about was the freezing blizzard that was rolling in tonight. The old-timers were saying that the Weather Channel called for 3 feet of snow overnight, and it had already started to powder as I'd left at 10. I had walked back home with only the streetlights to keep me company, a welcome change from the usual yarking in my ear of Kenneth. Now, it seemed, I would have to get loud with him all over again.
Yeah, you know why I had to stay so late? It was you. You didn't show up for work, so I had to do your job and my job tonight. I had to stock 2 departments in 8 hours, and then, when I couldn't get it done, I had to stay an extra 4 hours and finish your work.
He backed away, holding up the box of chocolates like it was a shield, clearly not receiving the greeting he had hoped for. "Yeah, I kind of had a little freak out when you said you wouldn't be my girlfriend, but I realized that once you had the chance to calm down, you'd come to your senses. And we could plan our date for tomorrow. Here, I got you these chocolates. It's kind of late to make a reservation for anywhere, but, He stopped talking when I slapped the box out of his hand, the half-eaten box scattering across my porch.
No, Kenneth, I will not date you. I will not walk with you to work. I'm through pretending to be your friend. Go away and leave me alone. Take a hint, you insufferable man-child. I don't like you, and I don't want to hang out with you.
I walked to the door and keyed it open, blocking it so he couldn't just follow me in. When I turned back to look at him, though, I was a little worried about doing this on the porch. Kenneth was breathing heavily, and I thought for a moment that he might be crying. The breathing was filled with rage, though, and I was suddenly very aware that I was a 5'2" woman yelling at a man who was nearly 6 feet tall and weighed about twice my weight. I suddenly needed to get in the house in a very short amount of time. I needed the door between Kenneth and I. I needed to call his mother, if not the police, and explain to her that her son was on the verge of a restraining order. "What the hell is your problem?" Kenneth bellowed, and I half closed the door as he turned to let his spittle of rage fly at me. "I'm nice to you. I try to be your friend. I bring you gifts. I do everything that a boyfriend does, and you still won't date me. That's not fair. You're supposed to love me. You're supposed to fall in love with me because I do all the things that girls like. I even went and bought the box set of Sailor Moon so we could just sit and watch it together, since I know you like that girly crap." He took a step towards me, and I slammed the door in his face. I had just engaged the deadbolt when he twisted the knob and slammed his full weight against the door, bellowing like a wounded animal.
Go home, Kenneth. Don't bother me anymore, or I will call the police.
He banged on the door a while longer, but I ignored him. When I had finished making myself a bowl of chili, I found that he had stopped pounding on the door. I ate my food, showered, got my clothes ready for tomorrow. On the off chance that we didn't get 3 feet of snow, I would need to go to work tomorrow and deal with Kenneth. He would likely be waiting for me as always, smiling his butter-toothed grin and waiting like an excited puppy for me to come out and play. I was snug in my bed, preparing to sleep, when I heard the music. The music was soft, romantic, and I thought for a moment that it might be something by John Legend. I could hear it coming from right below my window, and I flipped the covers back angrily as I went to have a look. Sure enough, it was Kenneth. He was parked in the snow, a large silver boombox in his hand, and as he lifted it up, bad 80s movie style, I opened the window. We made eye contact, his eyes filled with earnest emotion, and mine filled with nothing but puppy-kicking rage. I opened the window, chill scraping across me.
Go home, Kenneth.
"No," Kenneth said. "Not until you agree to date me."
You're going to freeze out there.
"Then let me in and keep me warm," he said, unable to keep that grin off his face. I just closed the window on him. He'd get cold and go home eventually. The music stopped about an hour later, and I guessed that his batteries had run dry after all that continuous playing. The next morning, I woke up to a sea of white. The snow hadn't been 3 feet deep. The snow had been 5 feet deep, and it spilled over onto my porch when I opened my door that morning. The wind was made of frozen razor blades, the power holding but flickering a little now and then, and I called work to see if I had to be there today. They said that they would be closed for the next few days. They told me to stay safe, and I decided to settle in for a well-deserved couple of days off. I had expected Kenneth to bother me since I was now trapped in my house, but he never came around. I got to enjoy a nice breakfast, and even got to watch some TV, before I was reminded that Kenneth existed at all. The knock came as the laugh track played on my 3rd episode of Friends, and I sighed as I tied my bathrobe so as not to give him any ideas. He would want to come in, pretending like we'd never had a fight yesterday at all, and I would likely have to yell at him again. I was surprised to see that it was Kenneth's mom, Janet, and not her portly man-child when I opened the door. "Hey there," she said, shivering on my porch as she pulled the scarf around her mouth. "I was just wondering if Kenneth was over here." Janet is, quite frankly, the sweetest woman I've ever met. In the 2 years I've been here, she's tirelessly fixed anything that's wrong in the townhouse, brought over food for things like 4th of July or Thanksgiving, and even apologized for Kenneth on more than one occasion. She's like Cartman's mom from South Park. She was a lovely woman, and while aware that her son was a nightmare, there was only so much she could do besides love him.
Not since last night, ma'am.
"Oh dear. Well, I do hope he's okay. He said you two had a little fight yesterday, and he was coming over to try to make up." I gritted my teeth hard enough to hear them creak, but I held in the rage I was feeling so I didn't cook this nice, oblivious lady alive. "Well, if you see him, tell him I was worried, okay?" As she left, I saw that someone had shoveled the sidewalk, and she had made a little path to my door. That was nice of them, but it seemed I really didn't have anywhere to go. The city was buried under snow and basically shut down. It appeared I could be inside for a while, and I decided to settle in and enjoy my time off. The weirdness didn't start till almost sundown. I was making dinner when I noticed a smell hanging around the apartment. I looked around, wondering if I'd forgotten to take the trash out or something. It was a wet smell, with an underlying odor of cologne. It was like someone had tried to cover a mess with deodorizer, and the longer I stood cooking at the stove, the more my head began to ache. The longer I stayed in the miasma, the worse the smell got, and the stir-fry I was making started to swim a little as I cooked it. I ended up eating it a little underdone as I fled the kitchen to the living room. As the swinging door opened, I stopped and basted in the swampy tang of smells from the living room and the kitchen. In the kitchen, it had smelled like funk. In the living room, it smelled like the inverse. Someone had been in my house. Of that I had no doubt. The smell of spray cologne was strong in here, like a pungent wall that surrounded the couch. And as I sat, I could feel something flaking beneath me. It was like sitting in a seat behind a small child, and as I looked, I could see chip crumbs sticking to my pajama pants. They were orange and smelled strongly of Doritos. I set my bowl down as I stood and walked through the house. I could see smudges around the room, especially on my figurines and some of my pictures. Someone with large, greasy fingers had been touching my things, and when I moved past the end of the table near the door, I took up the keychain with the mace on it. The doors were deadbolted, and though I didn't know how Kenneth had gotten in my house, I was certain that he was the source of this. If he thought he could hang out in my house and violate my privacy just to get his rocks off, he had another thing coming. My food was cold by the time I got done, triple-checking every room in my apartment just to be sure. There was nowhere he could have stayed hidden from me, not someone his size, and after spraying some Febreze around, I took my food up to my room and just ate it cold. I felt uncomfortable in the open down there, and as the snow blew and the wind howled, I sat on my bed and listened. At some point, I fell asleep, curling up in my bed as I listened to the silent house around me. When I came to, the lights were off in my room, and the curtains were thrown open to reveal a crystalline moon peeking in. The room was as quiet as the house, but I was aware of a heavy, wet sound as I came awake. It sounded like a dog, one that's been left out in the heat, and I scanned around to find the source of that heavy breathing. My eyes cast around, looking for the noise, and finally settled on a large black spot in the corner of the room. The darkness there was deep, the pitted murk blighted by a pair of small ovals that seemed to reflect the moon. The breathing was coming from there, and as it got heavier, the darkness seemed to shift unnervingly, like someone lurking in the gloom, trying not to be noticed. "M'lady," someone almost whispered, and I was up and across the room in a matter of seconds. I snapped the lights on, hands reaching for anything I could find to defend myself with. I expected to see him much too close as the lights came on. I expected him to bury me under his weight, pushing me down and feeling his hands as he tried to kiss me, to touch me. I gripped the ceramic vase as the lights came on, preparing to swing it and shatter it against his head as he... There was nothing. The lights came on and revealed nothing but an empty room with an anxious girl looking crazily around for an attacker who wasn't there. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat up and argued with myself until the sun came up. I knew what I had seen. I had seen Kenneth in the corner, heard the same deep, watery breathing I had heard 1,000 times. But I couldn't have seen him. Kenneth was a large and stocky fellow. There was no way he could have gotten away in the split second between the lights being off and the lights being on. This wasn't someone who could squeeze under my bed in a split second or slip into my closet without notice. Kenneth often got winded on walks to work, and the idea that he could quickly get out of my sight was laughable at best. Still, he had been there. That whole next day, I saw signs of someone having been in my house. It started as I finally got up for the day. As I came downstairs, I smelled something getting ready to burn in the kitchen. I pulled my robe around myself and quickly pushed into the cloud of smoke that awaited me. On the stove, smoke billowing up, was one of my good pans. I turned the stove off, jerking my hand away as I grabbed the handle of the pan. It was broiling. The burner turned all the way up, and I grabbed an oven mitt and took the pan off the stove. It wasn't until I put it in the sink that I saw a single blackened pancake at the bottom. A heart-shaped pancake. I was scraping the grit from the bottom of the pan when I suddenly heard an all-too-familiar theme song from the living room. The TV had been off when I got up. The lights dimmed to a soft glow. From under the swinging door, I could hear the TV blaring, and the pulse of bright lights clicked up to the max. I pushed in, expecting to find Kenneth parked on my couch, waiting for me with his big serial killer grin and his excuse of how, "Oh, well, the door was open, so he'd come right on in." But there was no one in the living room when I came through the door. There was, however, an indent in my couch, roughly the size of a large someone's backside. I searched the apartment again, already knowing what I would find, but needing the reassurance that I would find it. There was no one, just me, in my apartment. I turned off the TV and cleaned up the mess, waiting till 9 before calling my landlord, wanting to hear her tell me that Kenneth had come home. I wanted her to answer the phone and hear Kenneth in the background as he loudly whined for food or money or something. I wanted the confirmation that he was home, but I also feared it, because if he was home, then what the hell was going on around here? She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello? Hello? Did you find him? Please say you found my baby." I sighed, my hopes shattered.
No, ma'am. I was just calling to see if he had turned up.
I could hear her sob before telling me that no one had seen him and how worried she was about him, and to please call if I heard anything. I got dressed and decided to sit on the porch for a while, the house suddenly feeling too small for me. I thought I heard some rustling as I slid out of my pajamas and into some real clothes, but I did my best to ignore it as I made some tea and stepped out into the frigid air. The smoke from my tea plumed up as I sat on the swing that Kenneth had occupied yesterday, letting the cold air clear my head as I tried to read the book I had brought with me. The longer I sat, my eyes roving over the winter wonderland in my own yard, the harder it became to maintain my anxiety. I was making too much out of this. Surely I had been imagining things, or a power surge caused by the weather had turned my TV on, or I'd been sleepwalking or something. The more I let the cold wash over me, the more I assured myself that I was just being silly. As noon came and went, the cold beginning to abate and the snow starting to soften, I went back inside. My stomach was growling for some lunch, but the icy chill from outside made me long for a shower first. I had all but forgotten about my trepidation and anxiety, and simply wanted to be warm and snuggly as I enjoyed the rest of my afternoon. I would have a shower, put on some nice pajamas, make the stew I had set the ingredients out for in the fridge, and then head to bed after a nice evening spent at rest. As the warm water cascaded over my skin, I felt the cold dissipate and the leftover anxiety melting away. The shower had always been my safe place, my relaxation zone, and standing beneath the warm deluge made me feel a sense of peace that I'd been missing before the communion with nature. I washed my hair, lathering myself up, and just stood under the water as the soap and my worries slid down the drain. At least, I did, before I felt someone touch my hair. I have long blonde hair, the kind that falls to about the small of my back and must be meticulously maintained so it doesn't look trashy. If I'm sitting on the couch watching TV, there's probably a brush in my hand, and my hair is flipped over my shoulder. I've always been sensitive about my hair, and I don't let people touch it very often. So when someone ran their fingers through my long blonde mass of wet hair, my eyes snapped open, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I had felt the slight tug as 2 or 3 thick fingers slid down and parted the wet locks. I slipped as I stumbled forward, catching myself on the wall before I fell and hurt myself. Through the soupy curtain of foam, I looked around for the source of the touch, expecting to see him. I expected to see a bulbous shape leering at me from behind the curtain. But as I swiped the tangled muck out of my eyes, I was greeted with an empty bathroom. I came shakily out of the shower, hands trembling as I reached for my towel. I was shaken badly. I knew what I had felt. Enough men had tried to touch my hair for me to know what it felt like, and I couldn't trick myself into believing I'd just been imagining things. As I slid back into my clothes, the fog still thick around me, I was met with something even less easy to overlook. Written in the steam on the mirror, the lines reflecting my own horrified face back at me, was the word, "M'lady." I ran, half-dressed from the bathroom, and slipped on the surprise waiting for me in the hall. I went down hard on my backside, bruising my tailbone. The floor was covered with something that my wet feet found slippery, and now that I was on eye level with the floor, I could see them. They had been scattered artfully, leading towards my door in a line of red blotches. The rose petals would have been romantic on any other occasion. At the moment, they left me breathless as I leaned against the wall, watching the door creak slowly open. Behind it, the light in my room dimmed. I could see a thick, softly shadowed form, his eyes gleaming as his tongue slid over his thick porcine lips. I vaguely remember tripping down half the stairs, bruising my legs as I ran for the door. I remember grabbing my phone from the end table by the door, the charging cord coming free as I ran for the porch. I remember talking to the operator, my teeth chattering as I shivered on the porch. My hands and feet were numb, my hair getting stiff from the cold, when the lights lit the icy yard. The sun had started to melt the snow, even as it set behind the nearby houses. The lights on the snow looked odd, almost ethereal, and as they approached, I was thankful when someone threw a blanket over me. One of the officers stayed to take my statement, as the others searched the house. As I told him what had happened, I heard the snow crunch as my landlady came over to see what all the fuss was about. The police came from inside a moment later, shaking their heads and telling me they hadn't found anything. Someone was definitely in there, though. There were rose petals all over your bed and a box of chocolates sitting in the center. Someone had planned quite a romantic surprise for you, though I'm guessing the feeling wasn't mutual. I shook my head and started to tell them about Kenneth's ambush on my porch the night before. But that was when I saw him again. The snow had melted some, and I could see him hunched by the fence line. He was staying still, trying not to be noticed, but I had seen him. His ridiculous black trench coat was a dead giveaway, and I screamed as I pointed at him. His mother looked over my shoulder, pushing me aside as she ran towards her son. I grabbed the rail as I watched her go, the cops chasing after her, wondering why he hadn't moved. The jig was up. We could see him. Why was he just sitting there? When his mother started screaming, and the police officer started calling for an ambulance, I knew something was wrong. That was 2 days ago. He was dead, of course. He had frozen to death, waiting for me to invite him inside. They found the boombox sitting around his feet, frozen to the ground. His coat had been frozen to the back of the fence, and he had simply gone to sleep and never woken up. His mother, of course, was quick to blame me. Why hadn't I let him inside? Why hadn't I called her? And on until the police had finally taken her away. I had taken a few things and gone to stay at a hotel for the night. I just couldn't stay in that house, knowing that there was a dead body in my yard. I thought, at the time, that would be the end of it. They would take his body, and the weirdness would end. Even if his spirit was somehow attached to my apartment, I would just move. His mother wouldn't want me living there anymore anyway, not after I had led to the death of her precious angel. I would just take my things and go elsewhere. When I woke up this morning to find the words "M'lady" written on the bathroom mirror, I knew then that this wasn't attached to my apartment. The haunting had nothing to do with my place at all. He's attached himself to me. Lying here, writing this, I can already hear his raspy, phlegm-filled breath from the corner of the room. It appears that, unlike in life, I may be his M'lady after all, unwilling or not. I've been an artist for a few years now. I went to school with people whose understanding of art stopped at watercolors and still lifes, but those never really were my thing. I like to be experimental in my work, really push the boundaries of art. My high school art teacher, Mr. Caff, never really understood that, but it's probably hard to understand much of anything with your head firmly crammed up your backside. He was one of those types who thought the Renaissance was the birth and death of the artistic expression, and that digital art was tantamount to blasphemy. He did not tolerate modern art in his classroom, and I likely wouldn't still be doing art if it wasn't for Terry. Terry and I met in art class freshman year, and we've been friends ever since. Terry is your textbook manic pixie dream girl, and her artistic medium is pop art, with a soft spot for comics. She did all those reimaginings of classic comic covers, always in heavy oils and deep, saturated colors, and her work is really something to behold. Mr. Caff may not have understood her medium, but he understood her process, so she made straight B's in his class. I have a theory that he was trying to get into her ripped blue jeans, but manic pixie dream girls rarely fall for the middle-aged high school teacher, so tough break, Teach. The old bastard tried to fail me, on the other hand, but I rose above it, and now I'm one of the most well-known modern artists in the city, likely to his chagrin. My art is far from what you'd consider classical. I make sculptures from various mediums, do charcoal prints, weird displays of paints and acrylics, and recently I've begun doing metalwork sculptures in something I'm calling transitory mundane. The basic premise is that you take something normal, a refrigerator or a couch or a TV, and make it utterly mind-blowing. My horror fridge took first place at last year's Fall Gala, and my TV Apocalypse made the paper earlier this year. This time, however, I've got something really interesting in mind. Terry raised an eyebrow as I pulled the cover off my latest art project. I call it the Infinity Table. Terry looked dubiously at the rectangular living room table, a thick piece of glass sitting propped over a dark opening. It just looks like a regular table to me. I'm not sure what kind of concept you're going for, but I don't get it. I grinned as I leaned down, flicking a switch as the inside lit up to reveal the trick. Through mirror placement and strategic lighting, the inside of the table resembles nothing so much as a black pit that proceeds downward into infinity. A ladder was installed on the side and seemed to descend down into the pit. The mirror magnified it on and into the void. Terry's jaw dropped open as she oohed appreciatively over the illusion. The rocks on the walls and the crystal lighting, a really nice touch if I do say so myself. That is so cool! It's so simple yet intriguing. Everyone's going to want one after the show next week. But only one of them will get it. I think this may be my greatest art piece yet. The two of us cackled over my brilliance, and Terry told me about the panel series she planned to do for her own entry. Terry had been hard at work on an original comic series, so tired of bringing others' works to life and not getting to work on her own stuff. She was debuting a series of oil paintings from her own personal collection, and she hoped they would drum up some interest for upcoming series. I was listening, really I was, but my eyes kept being drawn back down to that yawning chasm that lay in the center of the table. It was an illusion. I knew it was an illusion. I had made it after all. But I couldn't keep myself from feeling the sightless black eye as it stared at me. It had discomforted me before, the way a scary movie makes you shiver even after it's over. But I always managed to shrug it off. I had created the illusion. I knew it wasn't real, but I could still swear that something lurked within it. I knew it didn't, but it still intrigued me. I was like a bird that knows the bag will trap him, but still wants to know what lies inside. Like a man who knows that the void stares back, but goes right on staring. Hello? Are you even listening to me? I shook myself back and apologized for spacing out. I flipped the light out on the table, and it was once again reduced to a black crater. Even turned off, I still felt like I could feel that inky mass looking at me, and I didn't like the crawling, scrabbling way it seemed to contemplate me. It had never looked at me like this during its creation, and it seemed to have gained a life of its own with its completion. It's cool and all, but I'm kind of glad you turned it off. I looked up as Terry shuddered, and the discomfort was an alien concept on her normally whimsical face. It scares me a little bit. I smiled, but I knew all too well what she meant. That's why Terry was my best friend. It was sometimes like we shared a brain. How did you even come up with something like this? She asked, still sounding equal parts terrified and amazed. I started to rattle off something about pure talent or the muse at work, but I honestly couldn't remember how I had thought of it. Had it been in a dream? It seemed like I had been inspired by something to build this piece, but I couldn't remember what. I had been so driven the last few weeks to finish it that I never really stopped to think why. Hello, you spacing out on me again? Terry laughed, snapping her fingers in front of my face. I shook my head, getting a grip before answering. Just the muse at work, I guess. I took her out for drinks then, wanting to forget about the feeling that dark eye had given me, as much as she did, but it was never far from my mind. When I stumbled back that night, the few drinks turning into a few too many drinks, I stood over the table and looked down into the dark, unlit eye. Even drunk, I felt the regard of that hateful space, and it sobered me a little. I could feel it staring at me through the flimsy haze that lay between us, and the dark hole seemed to long for its freedom again. I reached for the switch with a shaky hand, the mechanism snapping crisply as it came to life. The light came on, but it was cold comfort. The hole stretched into the earth, a dark and gaping maw that filled me with dread. Why had I created this thing? How did it occur to me to make such a hateful portal? How had I conceptualized this? The longer I looked into it, the more certain I became that I could see something at the bottom. It seemed to move within the dark eye, with frantic, herky-jerky movements. It moved like something in a claymation cartoon, and its regard was like wasps crawling on my skin. I didn't know what it was, couldn't even tell you how big it was, but as my hands trembled back towards the switch, I saw one thing for sure. It had begun to climb the ladder. The light snapped off with a smart pop, and I was left once more with only the dark haze across the glass. I went to bed, but my dreams were plagued by that bottomless eye and that thing that moved within. I didn't turn it on again until the day of the show. I honestly debated just pushing it into an alley behind my apartment and forgetting it ever existed, but I had too much time and money invested in the project to just walk away. The components hadn't come without a cost, and the prize money, not to mention the money I would make once it was sold, would allow me to do art for another few months. If it flopped at the show, I might have to actually find a job, and that would be the biggest blow to the art community imaginable. So I loaded it into the back of my ratty old pickup, the camper allowing it to ride in relative safety, and drove it to the gallery. I had secured it with a rope, not wanting it to tip over and break, despite my misgivings. I could tell myself that I kept checking the rear view the whole time just to make sure it wasn't getting damaged, but that was a lie. I wanted to make sure that nothing simply climbed out of it as I drove through the crowded streets of Seattle to what I hoped would be a feather in the cap of my career. My neighbor had helped me load the table. Beefy neighbors have to be good for something, right? And thankfully, there were burly men in black security shirts to help me unload it. They did most of the unloading and reloading onto the hand dolly, too, which was good because it had taken everything I had to put my hands on it as we loaded it into the truck. It had sat like a revered monolith in my living room for the past week. After I had woken up that first morning to a hangover and the sunlight illuminating the pit under that all-too-thin pane of glass, I had covered it with a tarp. I hadn't touched it, hadn't sat anything on it, hadn't even let my feet lean against it the whole week, and the thought of its surface against my skin made me feel crawly. I couldn't remember why I had been so excited about this thing, and only a feeling of deep revulsion filled me when I looked at it. If no one bought it, I had decided I would donate it to the gallery after the show. At least I could write that off on my taxes. Terry waved at me as she saw me coming in, and her little bird arms seemed ready to pop as she wrapped them around me. "I see you didn't get rid of it," she said with a smile, though her voice sounded strained. Terry wouldn't say so, but she seemed to feel the same trepidation I felt around the piece. I figured that someone would buy it, and who knows, the judges might really like it. She showed me her prints, scenes of dramatic heroes poised for battle, and spiraling cityscapes that oozed adventure, and I made the appropriate noises over them. It was always impressive what she could do with oils and paints, but tonight she had really outdone herself. I gave her another hug, wishing her luck as I pushed my hateful table over to the area that had been designated for me. A passing pair of lost frat boys helped me get it off the dolly, and far too soon I was left alone with this blight upon the world. I didn't turn it on. I honestly didn't really want to look at it, and I just contented myself to stand there as people bustled by and set up their own pieces for the show. 20 minutes later, my mind wandering, someone called my name, and I turned to find a stern-faced woman looking down at my piece. "What is it?" she asked, a ribbon on her shirt letting me know that, though she wasn't a judge, she was still very important. The ribbon let everyone know that she was a contributor, the color putting her in a high tier. "It's called an infinity table," I told her, her scowl not impressed. I reached down, my fingers trembling, and flipped the switch. I expected to see an angry something looking back at me, the glass bearing long cracks where something had battered it from the other side. But instead, it was just the same dark eye as always. It regarded the two of us with an unfriendly familiarity, and the stern-looking woman looked impressed as she took it all in. Very interesting. Not my style, but very interesting. You should leave it on if you want anyone to buy it. The endless tunnel is a definite selling point. I waited for her to move away before switching it off again. She had a point. If I wanted to get rid of this hateful thing, I needed people to see what it could do. The fear of something climbing out of it seemed silly now, as all these people stood around me, but it was a silly feeling that wouldn't abate. In the end, my greed overrode my fear, and I flipped it on so I could draw in some interest. Interest I found. People came over to have a look, and there was a fair amount of oohing and awing. They asked how I had done it, wanted one of their own, but I told them it was a one-of-a-kind piece and would likely carry a steep price tag. All the while, my eyes kept flitting back to the crevice in the center of the table, as though I expected to see something crawl up from the depths. I could see, or at least I imagined I could see, the stunted figure as he stalked about at the bottom of the pit. It was trapped there. This was its prison, and now I had given it a means of escape. I had invited it out of the pit, and now it could come into our world, and wow, how did you ever come up with something so cool? I started. Someone new had come up to ask about the infinity table, and I told them again about the concept. It all sounded so false to me now. I hadn't come up with the concept, though I could certainly talk about it in an educated manner. What a smart little bird I was. I could talk oh so prettily about my new project, using all the right buzzwords and trendy lingo to catch all these yuppies' attention. I was an artist. I created art, but I was beginning to feel like something else. This was beginning to feel like I was being used. Despite these misgivings, the show was going pretty well. People loved the infinity table. They thought it was really cool and a great perspective piece. I had a few tentative offers, but nothing serious. I would have probably taken the first offer, but the hole in the table kept distracting me. As I talked to people, I could see the small something beginning to climb the ladder again. It was still very small, like a fly crawling on a window pane, but as it climbed, it got larger and larger with each rung it grabbed. There was no way this could be real. I had built the thing. There was no hole in the void. It was all an optical illusion. Even so, the small creature was climbing up and up and up as these stupid airheads talked on and on about how much they loved my table. "Hey, you okay?" I jumped, realizing I'd been staring at the table for nearly 5 minutes. Terry was there, a well-dressed man grinning on her arm. Terry wasn't tall, but this guy looked like he might have had some hobbits in his family tree. He was short, hairy, dressed in a luxury white suit with a gold chain and a lot of very aggressive chest hair. I wasn't certain I could smell him. There were a lot of sweaty bodies, mine chief among them, but there was a definite tang of musky cologne and fragrant soap. Terry was smiling, but the smile looked paper-thin as the man, whom I was already calling Leisure Suit Larry in my head, rubbed his arm against her hip. "This is Clive," she said, indicating Larry as she slid herself free of him. "He liked my art so much that he decided to buy all 5 pieces. I just knew he had to see your infinity table, so I brought him over here to have a look." Translation, Leisure Suit Larry was Loaded Larry, and she was hoping she could solve both our problems. Larry had sized me up as she spoke, and I could feel my skin crawl under his less than altruistic stare. "I consider myself a lover of art, amongst other things. Did you make this?" he asked, looking down into the table as his eyes seemed to dazzle as they took in the sight of the gaping pit. "I did," I began, but before I could say anything else, I looked down at the table and felt my throat constrict. He was bigger now, the size of a thumbprint, and climbing fast. He was speeding up, climbing rapidly, and I wasn't sure how the others couldn't see him. Did they not see the shadowy little creature as it grew from a thumbprint to the size of a silver dollar? Larry was saying something, complimenting my work, but all I could focus on was the growing spot of black as it climbed like a mad thing. "I'm sold, love," he said to Terry, the word love making her flinch. "I'll pay you 30,000 for it." I couldn't speak. My throat was a stupid machine, incapable of doing anything but killing me slowly. The thing was twice as large now, growing quickly. I had no clue what I would do if it got to the glass and just started banging on that thin sheet of tempered material. Larry was looking right at it, his nose inches from the tabletop. How could he not see it? Playing hard to get, huh? Okay, 40,000 then. I could make out the top of its head, its face turned up to look at the land above. Its eyes were like twin coals, its mouth open in a leering grin, and its hands were covered in hair or tar or something. Its body was like an undiluted shadow, a golem of darkness that was climbing like a fiend to get at the lighted world above. It seemed like I might have unintentionally created performance art, I thought with a weak little gasp. Escape from purgatory in real life. Terry slid her hand into mine and squeezed, bringing me out of my panic. "What's wrong?" she whispered, seeing my face and sensing my fear. "You're a tease, aren't you?" Larry said, looking up from the table coyly. "Fine, but 50,000 is as high as I'll go unless you agree to have drinks with me after the show. Then I might be willing to go up to 60. "Sold," I squeaked out, afraid he would take it all back and leave me with this thing. He extended a hand over the table. As I shook it, I could see the creature's face coming closer and closer to the top. I pumped his arm twice before bending down to snap the light off. Can you take it now?" I asked him, my voice sounding frantic even to my own ears. "Don't you want the judges to see it?" Terry asked, a little confused. The panel of 3 judges were just coming to the display area, but I didn't want this thing close to me for more than a second. The hell with the judges. The fear inside me was like a starving weasel, and I feared it would burst through my chest any minute. "Can you?" I asked again, looming over him. He nodded dumbly, taking out his checkbook and scrawling out a business check. I took it, and he pulled out his cell phone as he made some calls. He excused himself, and before Terry could ask any more questions, I pocketed the check and left the gallery. I met her later for drinks, and she said Larry had excused himself after the purchase. He said he wanted to get it loaded and set up in his own exhibition right away. I think you scared him with your intensity a little. We laughed about it then, my soul lighter now that I didn't have to look at that hateful table anymore. I hadn't thought about that table until yesterday, about a week and a half after the gala. The check had been cashed, and the money had easily floated my art career for the next few years. I'd paid some bills, paid my outstanding credit card debt, and began living pretty comfortably off the excess. I was sitting on my couch, watching Netflix and eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, when my phone buzzed. It was Terry. She had sent me a news article along with a message telling me that I should watch it. "Your art piece just made the news in New York," she told me, and the lack of emojis and lols made me a little wary. I opened it up to find an article about a murder at the gallery of Clive Foreman. The proprietor, Mr. Foreman, had been found dead in his gallery in Soho Tuesday morning. He appeared to have been drowned, though no water could be found in his lungs or on the ground around him. Doctors say it's as though he simply drowned on the floor of his gallery and was left there. The next picture was of a very familiar table. It had been broken, and the glass lay gaping and jagged like an untreated wound. The article went on to say that the murderer had left a message on the wall in either tar or some kind of oil, and as I scrolled to the next picture, I felt the phone slip out of my numb hand. The message on the wall seemed to glower at me from the floor, and I drew my knees up to my chest as I tried to make myself stop hyperventilating. It read, "Your muse is free. My prison is no more."